Roland, I appreciate you taking time out from a busy schedule to come and speak with me on this program. I'm on the general topic of art and the spiritual life, and especially on this occasion, what I'm calling the prophetic experience, because I want to talk a little bit about the way that art shakes us up. I suppose a lot of art seems to reinforce our outlook on life. It makes us think we're on the right track. I think for many years religious art simply went along with the Christian message, reinforced it in one way or another. But there is really another function to art, which is a much more challenging one, I suppose, and causes us to see the world maybe in much different terms. It's sort of an experience of eruption, of change, of rupture in the way things ought to be. So I'd like to talk a little bit along that line.
Okay. One of the things that really has impressed me in the last few years is the whole movement called creation spirituality. I think it really touches what you're saying about transformation and social justice and the prophetic role of the arts. There are four paths that Matthew Fox, who has popularized it, and then originally Meister Eckhart in the 14th century, brought up, which was the path of befriending creation, and secondly of befriending darkness, and out of the dynamic of those two, the third path of being creative, finding out how to be befriending creativity. And then finally the fourth path, he says, that creativity leads to is transformation, it's compassion, it's caring about other people. And I would see that as one of the principal functions of art, that it should humanize the world, it should make it a better place, and make us care deeply about that whole process of peace and of justice. And I guess that's what you call the prophetic kind of thing in art.
I guess part of what the artist often sees is the tragic dimension of life. I'm thinking of Picasso's famous painting Guernica, which was in the Museum of Modern Art in New York and available to be seen. I know you saw it many years ago, and so did I. I mean, it's a most powerful experience, a gigantic work, and it was painted, as I recall, after the bombing of the Basque country, and it was Picasso's protest against that, and it's a very grisly piece in many ways, and it shows the horrors of war and the dislocations that occur, and so in one sense when you look at it, your immediate thing isn't to say this is beautiful, and it's certainly not comforting, but it is a challenge to say war no more, or I mean life shouldn't be like this, or we've got to get it integrated so it isn't like this. And of course I think we'd probably need a lot more examples that are more accessible to people. Not everyone's seen Picasso's Guernica,
well,
but
I would think
that would do the same thing.
Recent films come to mind, like Platoon, or Born on the 4th of July, or some of the films about the Vietnam War. They are really tough to look at. I mean, they're painful. Platoon was really an overwhelmingly sad film, and yet at the end of it, it is also a word that we've used about art before, exhilarating in some sense, that it brings you into touch with the possibility of a world where that doesn't happen, in a better world. And I think art ought to give the viewers some vision, some hope of how things can change. That's what Guernica did. That's back in Spain now, I believe, at the Prado.
Is it?
Since Franco was in power, he said he would never allow that back, and I believe it's now back in Madrid. It was black and white, that large painting, and these almost cartoon-like figures at times, but the cumulative power of that work and the sense of horror you felt at the one prominent figure is a woman who had been killed by some of the shells in the war and so on. You get that same feeling in Platoon of the villagers, the bystanders in this war who get killed just as surely as the combatants. And the work of art ought to give you some sense of outrage at the suffering of the innocent and what's wrong in the world.
I guess the reason I use the prophetic experience in relationship to this is because in the biblical material, that is the role of the prophet, in a sense. The prophet is sort of different from the mystic. The mystic senses the unity of things, that the world is befriended, to use your phrase before, that everything's united and ultimately harmonious and close to God, and there's sort of a positive upbeat feeling about the mystical experience and what the mystics write. There's a light that suffuses everything, and these apparent dichotomies between things, and separateness is just that, an illusion underneath it, everything's united. But the prophet has a different message. The prophet says, "Thus says the Lord, the day of judgment is coming." When you don't live up to the covenant, you're in trouble. Woe to you, Jerusalem. Woe to you, fat cows of Bashan, says the prophet Amos. Woe to you who practice injustice. And so it seems as though what the prophet sees is the inconsistencies in the world, the contradictions in society. He sees the way the world isn't the way it is supposed to be. And in the midst of that, and again true to the prophetic tradition in the Bible, always has a hopeful note that despite this horrible, messed up condition, God will not abandon you, that God is going to somehow straighten this out. There's always a message of hope. Even in the midst of Jeremiah's deepest lamentations, eventually you get to a notion that God will be faithful to the covenant and come back. So that's what I'm thinking. Parallel to the prophetic message of the Scriptures, we find artists who seem to have a prophetic function in song and music and painting. They are helping us to see these discontinuities and contradictions.
There's a wonderful book on the prophets called The Prophetic Imagination by Walter Brueggemann, and he uses a phrase that I think is a wonderful one to describe the prophets, that they had a ministry of imagination, which is another way of saying that they were artists. They were artists with words, they were artists with ideas, and in the case of Jeremiah with acting, I mean, he did a lot of acted out parables and so on. And Brueggemann says that the role of the prophet was to imagine a future and to imagine a world that was different than what the king wanted and what the authorities wanted and what they were saying, that this is the status quo. And then the prophet comes along and in the name of God says, no, the world ought to change. This is what's wrong. You should be faithful to God. And it's a wonderful phrase, a ministry of imagination.
Yeah. And then that brings us back to the artist as being the one who epitomizes imagination, who's able to see options or to see the world in a different form, and is able to reconstitute it out of its particularities into some more integrated form. So it seems to be what the artist is able to do, to open up possibilities. So it's a sort of a disclosure function, but it has a future orientation to it. And of course not all artists like that, but we're saying that some artists are able to do that kind of thing. We could look at the world of literature, couldn't we, in that regard, Roland, and think about books that have brought out for us the grapes of wrath. John Steinbeck would be one example.
Eugene O'Neill's plays are often about the outcasts of societies, the way in which society makes people suffer. I think The Iceman Cometh, perhaps his greatest plays.
Do you remember when they made a movie out of the Grapes of Wrath? It just came to my mind. I have a remembrance in my Catholic past that we were told you shouldn't go see that movie.
Really, yeah.
And I doubt if it was because of sexual questions, but I wonder why. I wonder why somebody was against that movie at the time.
I think, was it the 50s or what was it?
I presume.
Well, you know, I think at one time John Steinbeck was labeled in the McCarthy era as, if not a communist, a quasi-communist or a socialist, because he cared so much for the common folk, and that may have been part of the objection.
Possible.
It's certainly not a sexy film, so if the Puritans wanted to attack that one, I think they must be able to get better targets.
But there was some reason, and that's a very plausible explanation you've just given. I always wondered why that was. But we're talking about art now, the role of art, and claiming that's supposed to help us in the spiritual life. I suppose if you look at it from the viewpoint of what goes wrong for us, one of the things that happens in the spiritual is that we get complacent. We get self-righteous. We get our own way of looking at God and ourselves and our function in the world, and we're comfortable with it. And we're get too at ease with it, and we just drift along. And so complacency is a sort of enemy of the spiritual life. And maybe that is the task of the artist to draw us out of complacency, to attack that, to try to make us uncomfortable in a way. Of course, we don't like that, but maybe that's one of the things that art does that's good for our spiritual life, draws us out of complacency.
Sure. And gets us to think in different ways about who we are and about who we could become. I think of an example, this is not really social justice, but it illustrates your point, the play Our Town by Thornton Wilder, which has had its ups and downs as far as the critics go, and I think at one time it was sort of put down as not such a great play, but I have always thought that it was really one of the most profound works of art I know, precisely because the people are so ordinary. And as you watch that play, you can identify very deeply about your own growing up and your own family and who you are. And the final act takes place in the local cemetery. And it's all the people who have died, most of whom you have met in the play. And then the young woman who has just married dies in childbirth and goes to the cemetery. And it's really Thornton Wilder's idea of what happens after death, his theology of the afterlife. And I doubt that it's too accurate, but it's wonderfully thought-provoking. And after I see Our Town in a really good production, what it tells me is that since life is limited and I'm going to die, that I should take advantage of every moment, and live it with as much vitality as I can. And they're really, if I have listened to that, it changes me. Mm-hmm. It transforms the viewer. And I think that's what good art tries to do, should do.
So it really has a quality of shaking us up, and I think that's something we don't naturally seek out, Roland. I mean, a lot of people say, well, I'm not going to that movie, it's too heavy, all the Vietnam movies, or Mississippi Burning or something. I go out for light entertainment, or when I flip on my television set, I've had enough tragedy and grief throughout the day, and enough struggles and crosses. In a sense, I don't need another serious commentary on it. Or if I'm going to listen to music, I want it to be soothing and not somehow music that challenges my presuppositions about life. So, I mean, I think we have to factor that in. I mean, I certainly have a lot of empathy for the person who has enough cross to bear in life and needs a few moments of escapist entertainment. I mean, or needs to have mindless television just to sort of anesthetize themselves to the problems of life. I mean, I don't put that down at all. I think a lot of people survive that way.
Sure.
But I do think we have to ask ourselves a further question. Is the spiritual growth isn't just complacency, and it isn't just anesthetizing myself to the problems of the world. Somehow I have to get in touch with those. And somehow, if I'm to be a full spiritual person and an effective Christian, then the tragic dimension of life has to be brought into the mix. Somehow the dark side has to be brought into consciousness. As I said, I think of Carl Jung and his whole sense of individuation and how you grow as an individual. Only if you can bring the shadow side of your existence into the light of consciousness, thereby tapping its power and rendering its frightening side less scary. So I think that's part of what we would need if we're going to talk about the spiritual life here, that there's a way in which tragedy has to be brought into consciousness.
You have to stop denying it and face that aspect of life. I think it's fine, too, to watch some mindless TV or whatever for a while. If that's the only thing that one watches, though, and it really occupies all of our spare time, and then after a while the question arises of what we're running from and whether it's really healthy, and that we have not dealt with suffering or death or whatever it is that we deny. And if we now I know the feeling very well. I remember last year I was watching 30-something, which generally is a well-done program, but whatever the episode was that night, I was so tired, and by halfway through the program at 10:30, I was really depressed, and I said, this is stupid. And I remember turning it off, and I said, I hope you've got a large audience, but I can't stick with you tonight. I just got to go do something dumb and quiet. And sure, I understand that. I think you've got to be sensitive to your own feelings. But if one constantly refuses to face anything serious, you're really in a kind of denial that is unhealthy and unspiritual, too.
maybe the work of art that we're talking about that could help us is one that raises the dark side, brings the tragic to light, challenges our perceptions, but also contains some measure of hope that we're able to rise above or to make some progress. I think very often in modern films, at least, the emphasis in the heavy movies, the serious movies, is on great sense of tragedy, great sense of dark side, and just tiny little bits of hope that come at the end. However, maybe those, for some people, are enough. I'm trying to think of a good example of that now, and I can't. Was it the movie Mission?
Yeah, about the Jesuits in South America.
Yeah. Did that not have a hopeful, just a tiny glimmer of hope at the end? Well, I'm not remembering it well
there certainly was a hope throughout that these were people of spirit. I'm trying to think what the ending is now. I seem to remember they all got massacred, but as a matter of fact, that even in that kind of film, and I believe this is an example of it, there can be a triumph of the spirit.
Yeah.
That if you believe that we are eternal, and that simply the physical death is not the end, but really, from a Christian viewpoint, the beginning, then what happens to them is something. No, they're all massacred. Now I remember it clearly.
Yeah.
It is a terrible ending, and I think historically true. And yet the triumph of spirit that's there is
well, what about like One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest? I mean, everything goes badly, but there's still at the end the sign of hope.
Yeah.
And I mean, there's something more. In other words, I'm saying that if art is going to do this job we want it to do, draw us out of complacency, but give us a sense of hope, I think both things have to be in there if it's going to work for us.
I think you're right. And art, it seems to me, ought to give you some distance so that you can look at something as they did in the Mission, the death of really good people, and and for the most vicious kinds of reasons. I mean, they are killed by the Europeans. You know, it's done for greed. It's really disgusting what happens. But the artist ought to be able to let you look at life at its very worst. You have on one side the human potential at its lowest. On the other side, this wonderful triumph of the spirit of the Jesuit missionaries and the other Christians. But if you get too close to it, I can think of films, even Bergman, who is my favorite film director, made a very powerful film called Face to Face about a psychiatrist played by Liv Ullmann, and she descends into hell, really. I mean, she loses faith in her profession of psychiatry and then loses faith in her in life, and finally heads towards suicide. And I remember watching that and saying, this is extremely powerful filmmaking, but it's not giving me enough distance. I was really profoundly disturbed. And of course, you have to ask the question whether it's the filmmaker or whether it's you at a given moment. Because if you're really tired, sometimes you just say, I can't handle this right now, but then later. But somehow art ought to be able to let you have the emotions of life without living them. I mean, so you go crazy.
Yeah, that's a good point. I think that is exactly what it allows us to do, isn't it? I think, aren't we going through that with the Vietnam films now? In other words, we haven't been able to look at it for a long time. It's been one of the most painful incidents in our whole history. It's divided generations and people, and it seems as though we still need healing for this, and the films maybe are allowing us to do that. In other words, we see them from different perspectives. We maybe get a little tiny feel of what the horrible thing that the veterans had to go through over in that situation, and maybe it gives us more empathy for them. But it allows us, I think, as you're saying, to look at it in a way that is once removed, and as such, not to really crack up because we have to look at this terrible thing.
Well, it's significant that it's many years since the Vietnam War before we were able to have films, and you had to have some distance even in time. But then those films, the very best of them, like Platoon, Oliver Stone's, his later one, Born on the 4th of July, they then give us a framework of seeing. What was it that happened? What is the aftermath and its meaning to our country? What are the veterans going through now? And then to begin to see life as Ron Kovic experiences it as an amputee after the war and so on. That's what the great artists should do. An actor like who is the young man that played Tom Cruise. His talent and his ability. The writer, all those people enable you to see what you did not see firsthand, and then you experience it, and then you begin to be able to
maybe a lot of
think
times
about
maybe
it.
the viewer finds his own or her own way of pulling it together. Maybe we
Exactly.
find our own hope very often, even if the author doesn't give us a lot.
Yeah.
I'm thinking of the racism question, too. We've had powerful movies like that, Mississippi Burning,
Yeah.
and the Spike Lee film. Is that, what is it, right or wrong? Or is
Do the right thing.
Do the Right Thing,
Yeah.
yes, Do the Right Thing,
Yeah.
which, I mean, is a very powerful kind of statement of the racial tensions that we're dealing with in our country.
Yeah.
And again, hopefully allow us to look at it with some distance and to get some perspective on it, so maybe we can do something constructive about it. I suppose there's a notion of art that says art is self-contained, that the artistic experience is for the moment, and it discloses reality to us. But as we're suggesting here, there's also a transformation that ought to occur, or often does, and opens. I'm thinking of the fact that in communist countries, I think they wouldn't allow the playing of Beethoven's Ninth Symphony, with its sort of surging energy and spirit of liberation and so on, because they were afraid, I suppose, that it would rouse the people to some sort of revolution, or to go against the government, or at least plant the idea that we don't have to live in this monolithic communist society in this way. There's a surging energy inside of myself that resonates with this music that just might blow the lid off here. So maybe, again, that gets added from another aspect.
Oh, yeah. Well, it's very clear that totalitarian governments want to control the artists. That ministry of imagination that Brueggemann talked about is very threatening. In Russia, for example, under Stalin, the great composer Dmitri Shostakovich was constantly being threatened with being thrown in jail and so on, unless he wrote the kind of music that was sort of a march-like thing that said Stalin was a great guy and so on. Well, Shostakovich tried to write what they wanted, but his genius kept coming through and betraying them. And most totalitarian people are dumb. I mean, the fact is they don't know much about art. And a great artist like Shostakovich really got over a tremendous amount. But they want art.
He got a more positive message in. They often talk about that as socialist realism, art, and they want it to be done in a certain way. And it's really propaganda is what it is. They are forcing the artist to produce something that defends the communist system and so on.
We're getting into that, it seems to me, to some extent in our own country with this whole controversy about the National Endowment for the Arts, where people like Jesse Helms want to define art. And it seems to me that Congress does have the right to appropriate the money, and there is that issue of how public funds should be spent. But politicians are not the ones to define art. They really don't know that much about it, by and large. And they should go to people who are expert in that area and get their advice, and then try to follow. They do it with defense weapons. The politicians don't insist on building the stealth bomber. They go and get people, who know something about it. And yet they'll march right into this whole area of, let's say, the Mapplethorpe Photographic Exhibition, or some of the performers who have live acts, which they're now censoring, and tell them what they should be doing. And now I don't fully approve of everything. I'm sure that there are some of the pictures of Mapplethorpe, which I have not seen the exhibition, but I doubt if I would have enjoyed every picture there. But I do think the artist ought to be free, or you're not going to have art that's worthwhile. It'll just be propaganda.
And again, it seems only if there's a certain freedom with artists will they be able to be critics of society. I mean, only then can they challenge our perceptions, which we are suggesting here is a proper function of the world of art, that it is supposed to be able to open up possibilities or show us the way the world could be different, because most of us don't see that and we don't feel it. And we got an everyday existence. We got to get up, go to work, do our jobs, meet our responsibilities, carry on, eke out a little bit of leisure that we can find, get some escapist entertainment, and the life goes on in a routine fashion. Well, somebody's got to be around to be asking the question, does all this make sense? Are there contradictions in the society that we're not seeing? Are there ways in which preliminary things are being made into absolutes that ought not to be? They become idols, and do they not need to be challenged? I just thought of something, like the world of comedic art, the comedians, stand-up comedians, who often make fun of certain aspects of the political scene and so on. Maybe that's an art form that somehow critiques the society and keeps the politicians honest.
Oh, absolutely. Think of the example of Charlie Chaplin and some of the films he made, the one making fun of Hitler, the great dictator, wasn't it? Even the character the persona that he created of the little tramp who is the perpetual born loser and yet who triumphs. And he goes off into the sunset at the end with the girl in his hand and so on. And this says something about the human spirit, it seems to me. It's rather interesting that Hitler and Charlie Chaplin were born just a few days apart in 1889. And it was just last year that the centenary of their birth occurred. And very similar, their family background and so on. And yet what they did with their lives is 180 degrees different. And I think the difference is creativity. In the case of Charlie Chaplin, that allowed him to laugh, to make other people laugh, and to teach through that laughter. Hitler had something go terribly wrong, and we know how he wound up.
Well, it's an important contrast that you've suggested, and you've brought out the creative side of the artist, and so I guess it takes us back, Roland, to the idea that the spiritual life has to have a creative side, and it has to have challenge, because otherwise we fall into complacency. In the world of art, whether it's music or stand-up comics or Charlie Chaplin or Beethoven's Ninth Symphony, has a way of challenging our ordinary perceptions, of suggesting new modes of human existence, and as such I think it opens up a new world and possibly puts us in touch with the one we call our God.